As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. And on today's episode, we're going to do a little Q&A. We have a number of questions that people on YouTube have posted, and we are going to work through them, try to answer them. But before we do that, I do want to do a book reading update, even though it's a busy season. I know that you all don't have a lot of time for reading, but because I really just want to talk about what I've been reading. Is that okay?
I'm thrilled. I actually finished a book last night, and I was hoping you'd ask this question. I am ready for it.
This is exciting. Well, let me say that I confessed on the podcast a few weeks ago that I have a principle of living where if I'm listening to an audiobook, always rewind. If I zone out and I'm not listening, always rewind.
Yep.
I did that with The Beautiful and the Damned, and I just finished it. And it was good. I enjoyed it. I really want to talk to somebody who's read it, who I have a theory that Gloria in the novel is a metaphor for art. And I want to hear from somebody if they think that that's true.
Now,
but
is that his first book?
I believe it's his second. I think he wrote This Side of Paradise first, and then
Okay, I think it's This Side
Beautiful
of
and the Damned
Paradise I
second.
read. I have not read Beautiful and the Damned.
Yeah.
Sounds like you need to participate in our book club and get us to read it.
Yeah. Well,
That's what we could read next.
We could read
So
It
we
was
could help
okay.
Shane.
yeah. Well, I'd like to talk about it. And then I also finished Orthodoxy. So I finished Orthodoxy and The
Oh,
Beautiful and the
man, I
Damned.
haven't even started it. Don't tell Lee because then she'll be
you ever
disappointed
read
in
it?
me. No,
You've never read Orthodox?
that's exactly Lee. Lee literally, I thought was going to come across the room after me because I haven't read it.
That is
Yeah.
my
I
central
didn't want
book.
that to
I'm
happen.
going to read it.
It was very good. And then, so those are the two books I've been reading. So I started, a lot of times when I reach a lull in my reading, I read chess books. So I've been reading my 60 most memorable games by Bobby Fischer, famous American chess player.
Huh.
Not fun. But I'll get to
I
more
had
serious reading soon.
No idea about this, about you.
Yeah,
Like, this-
I
not
didn't
a
either.
ton.
I didn't
It's
know
not
you were a
like
chess guy.
I am a chess guy, but the book reading is more recent.
Yeah.
Paul, what'd you finish last night?
I also finished 2 books. This is crazy. First, I finished Don Quixote. I wasn't going to mention that, though,
Wow.
because it's taken me so long, but I did finish it. The second part is...
Your mother and I are very proud of you.
Thank you. I might say that the second part's better than the first, but we have to discuss that next week.
Interesting.
We'll see. I found it more comedic. It was more enjoyable to me. And I finished The Sounds of a Wild Snail Eating. And that was gifted to me by Angela and Demery at HLS Houston. And
out.
it's a phenomenal book. I very much enjoyed it. And it's
Doesn't sound like it would be a loud book.
it is very much in the spirit of like Henri Fabre and the naturalists of the 19th century. And it's the story of the author ends up with some disease the doctors can't identify, and she's basically bedridden for I think years. And this is a story of a year where basically one of her friends brought in like a plant from outside and said, there was a snail, I brought that in too. And like she wakes up in the middle of the night and can hear it eating just because everything's so silent and she can't do anything. And she starts observing this snail's life and realizing how much she's learning how to handle her own difficulties by just watching this snail. It was it's very much a meditation on the natural world, and it's beautiful.
It sounds beautiful.
And right up your alley.
Man, right up my alley. Yeah. Only took me, I think they gave it to me like 2 years ago. Only took me like 2 years to pick it up.
Hey.
But
Did
it's
she get
phenomenal.
better?
She does actually.
Okay.
At the end, in the epilogue, you find out that she does.
Very good.
They find a way.
Spoiler alerts.
Yeah.
All right. Tanya, Martin?
I'm reading Louise Penny's new book. Nothing serious at the moment because
It's Christmas.
I'm doing lots of parties and church events.
Is that an Inspector Gamache book?
It is. It is. It's the brand new one.
I read, and it wasn't, I don't even think it was the first one. It was just one that was like on a audio book sale or something. And I only got about
Yeah,
a third
Paul
of the
read
way
the first
through.
one and didn't really.
I mean, it didn't inspire me to go read the rest. It was fine.
To me, he's the ideal man besides Atticus Finch.
Inspector Gamache?
Mm-hmm.
I thought
Yes.
you said Paul was the ideal man.
I should have let that
Okay,
say.
let's clarify. No, Gamache, I think, is the ideal. He's just the ideal man. Not Paul.
Martin, who do you
Not
think is the ideal man?
I mean, in literature, who's the ideal man? Don't you think Atticus Finch?
I think he's, in terms of just nobility, I think Atticus Finch is up there, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I finished, I went to California for a week to visit my stepmother and finished Wendell Berry's new book,
The Need to
Be Whole, which was really excellent. I really enjoyed it. And then I just finished 2 nights ago Joseph Pierce's book on Oscar Wilde. And it was one of the most, what's the word? It just hit me like a ton of bricks, like no book I've read recently. Number one, it's very well written. Of course, Joseph is on our staff at Memoria College and did a class on Oscar Wilde. And it is such a tragic life, and in another sense beautiful, and in another sense very ugly. And he dies a pauper, loses his wife, his children, everything because of sin. And yet on his deathbed converts to Christianity. And after I finished the book the other night, my wife had driven up to Louisville. I was still in Danville, at our Danville home, and I had to call. I was so depressed. I had to call her, and of course she didn't answer. I didn't talk to her the next day. But I mean, it was. But his whole thesis is that in Wilde's essays and criticism, has this degenerate pose. He was one of the decadents. And he has this pose that's this decadent pose, and yet in his fiction, he rises above that, and it's all regenerative and sometimes explicitly Christian. It's just this very strange thinker. But it was a wonderful book. And then now I'm reading The Seahawk by Raphael Sabatini. And when I'm done, I might throw it in my trunk.
Yes, so that I can have it next Christmas.
Curate
that would be
it for a year, and then give it to Tanya next.
That sounds great.
Christmas.
I look forward to that moment.
Well, a vibrant reading update. I'm surprised. Y'all are reading a lot. So we have a bunch of questions here, and they're all over the place.
And you haven't shown them to us. That makes me a little nervous.
I've intentionally not shown them to you because I want your reaction. So the first question, we'll start with this. This is from Eric Collins, and he wrote this in an artful way. He said, "This is something I've often felt, even in my own life. A wistfulness for something that never was. A classical education, steeped in the classics and taught properly how to think. For adults who miss the opportunity to have a classical education, what are your recommendations for resources and other ways to recapture this missed opportunity?"
I think 2 basic things. One is, I think it is very beneficial to learn Latin and use a program like ours, which steps you through it in a very organized way. I read now the Vulgate Bible, the gospel reading every day in Latin. That's how I keep it up. I used to taught it for 20 years. It'll organize your brain. It will teach you the roots of your language so that you see English in a very different way. And then also I would say, and let me say 2 things. One thing is, I have a whole talk on the 5 classical books, which are the Iliad and Odyssey, Homer, one book in a sense, Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Comedy, the King James Bible, and the plays of Shakespeare. But you do need some preparation to do those. John Sr. used to say that you need to read the 1,000 good books before you can read the 100 great books. And so I think, you just need to read widely, generally speaking, all the time. And because it's hard to approach the classics, the great books, if you're not a reader. I've seen people who are just overpowered by a book. Rod Dreher, the conservative writer, I had dinner with him at a conference one time, and he told me he just didn't read fiction. And I gave him this little lecture, and I told him to read Anna Karenina. Instead, he read Dante. And then a year later, he's got a book out called How Dante Changed My Life. And I felt like, Rod, you don't read fiction, so you read the first great fiction work and it changes your life. You know what? The second will too, and the third and the fourth. So it's strong drink. But that's how I would say Latin and the best that's been thought and said.
Tanya, what about you? Do you resonate with this wistfulness for something that you never had? Or
Yes, but I got it through my children, through studying with them and reading everything that they read for a while until they got ahead of me in high school. But that was really the beginning for me, and that was really where I needed to start. I couldn't have started with Dante. I had read Shakespeare, but when you read Shakespeare as a college student, that's just a whole different thing. You're reading for a grade, and you're just trying to get through that next semester. So, and of course, I've read the King James Bible, but Dante, Homer, I didn't read until my children read it, except in high school, little excerpts of it, but of the Odyssey, probably. But then I got to the point where I could read more, but also for me, climbing Parnassus, which I hate to even mention because it's hard to find right now because it's not available at the moment, though it will be. Again, I could talk about the printing industry for a podcast, but I won't here. It's just that is the book if you can find it.
Yeah, the best way to learn is to teach. And so if you have children and you're homeschooling, that is the best way. That is the best way to start.
Yeah.
And if you don't have children and aren't homeschooling, what's going through my head is become a part of whether it's an informal or a formal book club, not like Oprah's book club, but a book club that's reading these good books, and talk about it with somebody. Because just like what you were saying, Shane, where you read this book by Fitzgerald and you felt like you needed to talk about it, if you just read it and you put it to the shelf, you don't push yourself through that exercise of making sure that you've read it deeply. And you need that exercise so that because people can read great books and maybe they've got a high level of reading and they're just reading it for the story and they never think what of it. Yeah. Right. And that's
hard to do alone.
Very hard to do alone.
I had a professor in college who challenged me to write one page about every book that I write, 300 words or so or every book I write, every book I read, write 300 words. And I've loved going back to those, but that's just kind of the only thing you can do if you're alone. If you have other people, you tease out that page in other people's experience with the book.
And mark your book. Mark your books as you read, mark them so you can go back and find. Just, I find after I've read a book, to go back then and look through my notes is just a really eye-opening overview that you really need to do to revisit, which is kind of like your 300 words about each book. Is the same. It's accomplishing the same thing.
Next question is from Nick Dellis. And next to his name, it says on YouTube, he's a longtime subscriber. Also, Nick Dellis is the head of a school in Kenosha. I'm a big Nick Dellis fan. So this is a good question. Nick asks, he'd be interested in hearing us compare new math with Singapore math. Now, we're not Singapore math experts at this table, and I didn't prep them with this question. New math, as I understand it, is kind of a fronting conceptual mastery above arithmetic elasticity. And Singapore math, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I know that a big piece of Singapore's process is a method. There's a method of helping students to take the abstract and making it concrete. Regardless of our level of understanding of Singapore, what are the relationships between the math curriculum that you all have looked at and the new math? What makes those curriculum distinct or similar to new math?
Well, I think your definition of new math, sets it up really well, right? Where if you're putting in front the conceptual understanding with a disregard for the age and development of the student, then you're going to end up with students who don't really understand anything, right? Or maybe they have this general idea, but no idea how to put that into practice. And so I think you just use that in that sort of principle. You can use that in evaluating any program where you say, okay, what does a kindergartner need? A kindergartner, things have to be very concrete, right? So got pictures of ducks. Is it ducks these days? I can't remember.
Oh, now it's crayon boxes.
Crayon boxes.
Ducks may still be in there.
I'm not sure.
Ron staff has different animals throughout.
Yeah. And different programs will use manipulatives, which are fine, but we try to get away from them quickly so we can move from that concrete to the abstract, right, where they're doing it in their head. And so, like you said, I don't know that anybody's really dug deeply into Singapore here at this table, but that's what I would use to evaluate that. And in my conversations with administrators and some that have used Singapore, what you have to watch out for is that you're not completely getting rid of the mastery of those arithmetical skills, right? So people were bringing in Singapore with the express goal of, well, we want them to understand the concepts, and they were completely throwing away all drills, all making sure that the student had facility with arithmetic. And then in recent conversations, the administrators that have seemed happy with Singapore are the ones that have supplemented it with drills and making sure that arithmetical skill is mastered in the younger years.
And the other thing that for schools, I think has been a problem when I have talked to schools that have used it, is that it's expensive and it requires a lot of the teacher because it is more than just basic arithmetic, and it requires a lot of the parent. So they struggle sending homework home because the concepts are not.
That method is very specific.
It is, and so
and not what parents are used to.
Right. So the follow-up question then, Tanya, is below. Amanda asked this question. She loves using Rod Staff Math, but why did we choose it? Why did we choose Rod Staff Math for our arithmetic program in the lower school?
It was really a process of elimination. Cheryl looked at every math program out there, and it was the one that was traditional that she looked at all these old math programs like Iroquois books and books from the 1800s, early 1900s.
1940s and 50s.
She bought all of those, and she would sit at her desk and actually do some of the drills, and she couldn't do them as fast as and she said, we're really dumbed down. Like, I can't do there's no way I can do these as fast as they expected a third grader to do them back then. And so she was looking for something as close to that as possible to replicate that mastery and that instant recall of arithmetic. And then Brian has been teaching a PSAT class and an SAT class down the hill. And he said that the biggest problem with high school students is they haven't mastered decimals, percentages, those things that they need. They're ready to understand the abstract concepts because we've prepped them well for that are in high school math. But they just, if they haven't mastered those basic skills, we're wasting time on that when we've got these early years to do that.
There's this on our file system at Memoria Press, which has a bazillion files and it's possible to navigate. There's this one file called Cheryl Lowe's files, and then there's this one called labeled 2005, and it has 4 videos from her. And I've listened to all of these multiple times, and one of them is the math one. Mm-hmm. And she kind of goes through talking about how she went through all these different old curriculums. And she makes this statement at the very beginning of the episode where she says one of her guiding principles and I never got to talk to her about this, I'm sure you guys did, was not necessarily listening. She said, I didn't go and study like what people were saying are the most effective math programs. She said, I'm consciously trying to go back to what was done before because it had been done for a long time, and there's a conscious reliance on tradition. And so part of her reason for Rod and Staff is that it looks the most like what people had been doing for a long time to teach math.
If Cheryl believed that the math books of around the 1950s were the best math books because they had it right conceptually. They had the traditional conception of how particularly arithmetic should be taught, but they had gotten the formatting finally right. And then after that, conceptually, they start wasting away. I have not reviewed Singapore. Now, what I have heard about Singapore, and I'm not a math person, so it's kind of ironic that the most widely read article I ever wrote was called "Why Johnny Can't Add." But on Singapore, what I've heard is that it's a brand. It's an American brand. It's not what is done necessarily in Singapore. That what is done in Singapore is very Rod and Staff-like. I mean, the reason that Singapore math is popular here is because the country of Singapore outperforms just about every other country in the math comparisons in international math tests. But if you read up on what they do in Japan, in Singapore, all over Asia, it's very much memorization and drill and practice, and that's just that's how they teach everything over there, and that's why they do well in math, is because they know that stuff. In the book, which is the best book written on this, called "Why Johnny Can't Add" by Morris Klein, he makes the statement that in terms of arithmetic, which is what we're doing in the early years of school, that we don't want we don't want to study it to think about it. We want to study it so that we don't have to think about it. We want those things to be so ingrained in our mind, the process, because arithmetic's just a tool. You go back to the ancient Greeks where they're contemplating the whole idea of one, but that's not what we use it. We're teaching it as a tool, and when you're teaching it as a tool, you don't ponder your hammer if you're a construction worker. You just learn how to use it, right? You don't have to know the whole history of the hammer. You don't know, who thought up the hammer and why they built it the way that. You just learn how to use it for something that for whatever it is you're working on. So you don't have to think about it. You just learn how to use it, and you learn how to use it in a way that you don't think about that anymore. And that's the way we've always looked at math, and that's what Rod and Staff does very well.
Yeah.
But it also allows you to think about it when you're older and at a point where you can think about it.
Right. It's the tool you need to learn how to think about higher mathematics when you get up into algebra and all that sort of thing.
Which again goes back to the whole premise for our curriculum, is that it's age appropriate, and time on task is so important. So we want to spend those early years doing what students do well in those years. And then when they're ready for more abstract concepts, then we've mastered what they're good at in those years. So why waste time doing abstract concepts that they're not ready for,
right,
when we could spend our time doing something of much more value?
Tanya, let's get away from math.
Okay.
For your
Thank
sake.
you.
Yeah. Austin asks about Greek. He's a member of an Eastern.
You're going to me about Greek?
Well,
I think this is appropriate.
I've got questions to ask her too that she doesn't know about. I'd love to hear her answers.
So he's a part of an Eastern Orthodox church, and so he wonders, I see the value of Latin, but is there help in studying Latin to learn Greek or other Slavic or Eastern European languages?
I think that we've come across situations where we'll have an Orthodox school, and so they're wanting to become classical, and of course, normally what you do is learn Latin, but their tradition is Greek, and just pedagogically, in normal circumstances, Latin is better to learn first because it's a much more regular language than Greek. There's a lot of subtleties to Greek. But if you're coming from an Orthodox background, and that's your theological tradition, and the works that your kids are going to probably study first are going to be Greek, I don't see that it's a bad thing to do Greek first in that particular situation. For most people, it needs to be Latin, I think. But I think there's an argument to be made that it's okay to learn Greek in an Orthodox school.
Well, and one of the arguments that we would make about why Latin first is, I mean, you're dealing with the same alphabet, right? So you're dealing with a young student, but in an Orthodox church, right? In the art and what they're seeing on the walls every week or multiple times a week at church, they are seeing those Greek letters, right? So those would not be as foreign to that student than they would be to other students. The other thing I'd say, I mean, at HLS, you're right, we start Latin in 2nd grade and Greek in 7th. When I was a kid, I started Latin in 3rd grade and Greek in 9th. And my experience learning Greek in 9th grade was, okay, I have to learn a new alphabet and new declension paradigms, but all the hard work I'd done of understanding grammar had given me a way to get much more quickly into the meat of Greek, because I didn't have to sit there thinking about and really mastering the idea of an indirect object, right? That had been pounded into me through Latin.
And we hire a lot of seminary teachers to teach Latin who have never had Latin, but they've had years of Greek. And so it works the opposite direction too. Mm-hmm. They understand grammar and they understand how declensions and conjugations work. So it's you could start with either really and get the same major lessons.
Yeah, I learned Greek in graduate school right after college, and then I came to Latin later. But even having done that, I always thought, well, it would have been better to learn Latin first, just because the rules always apply, and which is not the case in Greek, and the grammar's just clearer. It just stands out clearer in Latin than it does Greek.
Yeah, is augmentation the right word, and reduplication?
Augmentation and reduplication.
Those, and the vowels contracting for the augmentation and reduplication, those are prefixes to verb forms.
Your Greek you're still sharp. You got the aorist on lock.
That is difficult, because you're having to actually understand the sounds of the vowels and how the vowels are going to contract, and therefore, you put these two vowels together, and that's going to make this vowel. It's a lot more for a young student to really
morphologically complex.
It is more morphologically.
But ultimately, we want to do both.
Yes. I have a friend he's the head of the Latin department, I believe, at the Ambrose School. He's a good friend, and he's always used this illustration between Latin and Greek, that Latin is like the piano and Greek is like the electric guitar. In Latin, you have all these keys to work with. It's very orderly. You can, it's very solid, but it's not flashy. It's simple and it's straightforward. Whereas with Greek, the electric guitar, it's fantastic, and there's subtleties and nuance, and the participles are going everywhere, and the tenses are not really tenses, and there's complexities to it. But to learn the piano first is how you lock in your music theory, and then you go to the electric guitar. And I think that that's a good way to illustrate the path that we've chosen for our Latin to Greek course of study. And my friend Austin came with that illustration, not me. So our next question is from Aaron Jahi, or possibly Yahi, Jahi. Jahi. What about neurodiverse students in a traditional setting? Now, I don't know exactly how you would medically define the term neurodiverse, or if there is particular definitions about that. So instead of answering that question directly, I would say, what about students who appear to genuinely struggle with the orderly classroom environment of a place like Highlands Latin School?
Well, I will tell you that having run the online academy for a number of years, I talked to a number of parents who had their kids in our program, and they had them in the Latin courses and had them in a number of things, but mainly the Latin courses. I noticed this, and talking to them, and there was 2 or 3 of these ladies who were special needs teachers. And I said, well, that's interesting. Why do you have your kids in a Latin? Because it's organized. Mm. The more for those students who have those kinds of those particular kinds of challenges, She says the more order you have and the more orderly the subject is, the better off the child is. And, that's what we're all about is not only orderly subjects that are taught orderly, but sometimes sort of disorderly subjects, which we try to tame. And that's I don't know what child that's not good with. What kind of child that's not good
and
with.
I think also, your point about the online academy kind of brings me to the in a homeschooling setting, right? It gives you the flexibility to say, this subject we are going to be kind of this orderly, right? And this is the way we're going to do that. Then maybe we're going to take a significant break, right? Whereas maybe in a school, okay, you've got a 45-minute class and you got a 2-minute break and you got another 45-minute class, and it's just on and on and on. And maybe in a homeschool setting, you can say, well, okay, we realize we need to change our pace. Maybe when we're doing school, we're very orderly, we're very structured, but we're going to do that in a 20-minute, segment or whatever it is, whatever the child can handle as they age and develop and grow.
Well, and the other aspect of that, I don't know if this is exactly what the person asking the question was looking for here, but when you say neurodiverse, because I'll hear people ask, well, what about, my kid's really good at math or my kid's really good at something else. And so they'll feed that and they'll focus in on that. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing to do. Again, I've quoted the baseball player Pete Rose. Why were you such a great all-around baseball player? Because I practiced the things I wasn't good at. You're trying to produce a well-rounded student, and if you just take the one thing they're really good at and you concentrate only on that, you're not serving them very well.
No.
So I agree with all of that.
Good.
But I would like to add that I think the most important thing here is to know your student. There is so much advice out there, and there are so many people saying, this is how you need to treat this particular child or this condition that this child has. But I think the most important thing is just that you are the parent and you know your child better than anybody else. And so you do listen to all of that, but then don't let it trip you up. Do what you feel like is the best thing for your student. And you do have the flexibility to do that in a homeschool environment. So if you need to slow it down, slow it down. If you need to do 5 subjects instead of 8, do that. But really, and just make sure your student is progressing. Don't try to monitor that based on what other students are doing or try to reach some unattainable goal. So don't overdo it. Definitely challenge. You have to keep progressing and challenging, but not to the point where you're expecting your student to do something that they are going to fail with. And this, I would say the same thing in the classroom. My students that I had who struggled, I had great success with in partnership with their parents who knew them better than anybody. And as a teacher, you really need to respect those parents and listen to them and figure things out together in a partnership. I think we don't have any real severe needs here on our campus. We don't have the capacity for that. We don't have therapists on staff. We don't have any of the help that a lot of schools do have. But I have had students that had charts this thick of stuff I had to read about, with issues that they had. And they were very successful students, but their parents had to work really, really hard at home to make that happen. And they had to be dedicated, and they had to be able to have the courage to say to their teacher, this is what we're struggling with, and this is what my child can do. Can you help me then modify the curriculum so that will work?
Well, the other thing too is I think a lot of schools throw a lot of things at students, and I think one of the disservices we do is to try to throw too many things at them, none of which they learn how to do very well. It's better to learn a few things really well And you have to, right now there's a crisis in this country because of the whole COVID lockdown situation, because a lot of kids didn't learn how to read. And if you don't learn how to read by fourth grade, you
just need to stop and learn how to read.
You need to stop and learn. I mean, this is just hugely important. I mean, reading is one of those things you need to learn how to do and do well. That is so focus on the main things first and get those out of the way, and don't listen to all these people who've got some glitzy new program that they want everybody to use. Do a few things well.
And we have a lot of curriculum, and it looks like our standards are really high. We've got supplemental reading books. You could take our curriculum and be totally overwhelmed if you looked at it all. And I feel like I'm constantly saying to people, you don't have to do all of this. You're homeschooling because you want flexibility. And so you can have that flexibility, and you don't have to feel guilty for not doing everything.
I think it may be a corollary to Martin's point that you don't have to do everything, but you should do at least some things well, is that if your student can't even do some things well, have them do great things, whatever those, as well as they can. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a part of, Cheryl Swope's message, is that however well they can do it, have them do great things.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up Cheryl Swope, because I wanted to mention, if you go read Simply Classical, and I think this was coming out of the pedagogy conversation we had, right? So, insofar as how she was teaching Michael and Michelle, like I have this recollection of the kids bouncing on balls as they're reciting their Latin, right? Like in a school setting, having 10 or 15 kids bouncing on balls while you're studying Latin is not going to be helpful. But in a homeschool setting where she had neurodiverse children with significant needs, that was a way that she was getting their physical needs met, working on physical strengthening, and engaging their mind and mastering that Latin that was helpful. And so this, as much as we push traditional pedagogy, it doesn't mean that in your particular scenario, you have to have your 3 kids sitting in little desks in one room of your house for 8 hours a day. Right. I mean, that's just, you have to, as Tanya said, you have to know your child and do what you have to do to take the principles of a traditional pedagogy and meld those for what you need, what your child needs.
Before we had a curriculum, I used to speak at homeschooling conferences, and I had a talk called the 4-subject curriculum. And basically that was, after you've done your basic skills, reading, writing, and penmanship. After you've done those in first through second grade and in kindergarten through second grade, then it's Latin, math, composition, and a whole bunch of books. And so if you have mastered Latin, so you know your grammar really well, you're translating into English, which in and of itself later on as your translations are longer, is a composition exercise. It's imitation in a way. You're on grade level in math. You can write a paper, a competent short paper, and you have read, when I say a whole lot of books, I mean, books of history, books of literature, and you've read all the ones you should have read by that time. Then what are you missing?
Science.
And so science. Well, in science, I meant to say science in there. But I think what we've been doing at Memoria Press since then is we have been kind of fleshing out what all the other books is,
right,
and trying to organize that a little bit better.
I think that's a good answer. So let's go ahead and end on this question from Peter Brown. Let me read Peter's question. It's well put. So who is the cooler dude, comma, C.S. Lewis or old J.R.R.?
Are you looking at me first? If I could
unpack this idea of cooler dude.
Yeah, that's right. It's a nuanced term.
I thought it was going to be one of you, and I got to answer.
Oh.
Well, there's a very good book by Humphrey Carpenter called The Inklings, and it tells the whole backstory of their relationship and all this sort of thing. And, I think Lewis ended up being more celebrated, but if I have to choose between one of them, I'm choosing Tolkien. There's just something something deeper about Middle Earth than about Narnia. I mean, I like Narnia, but I think Middle Earth goes deeper than that in a lot of ways. So in the end, I end up going with Tolkien. But I don't have to choose, which is the nice thing.
Oh, I'm making you choose.
I'm choosing C.S. Lewis because I don't like fantasy, which is all I've read that Tolkien. Did he do anything else? And so I'm not really even a big Narnia fan, but I do recognize the brilliance in both. Let me say that. But for my preferred reading, I mean, Mere Christianity to me is the book I go back to over and over again.
I don't know if this is true because I'm not like a scholar of Tolkien or Lewis, but I think a part of coolness is this kind of removed condescension to others. And I get that sense from Tolkien that he kind of thought Lewis was a little beneath him because he was a real artist writing fantasy and he was a real linguist. And he, so I think that maybe he's the cooler dude if we're talking about coolness in the abstract.
Can I amend my answer?
Sure.
Okay. I'm faced with the question, either C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien. And my answer is G.K. Chesterton.
Paul?
Well, that saves me because I was going to have to really hurt myself and say I agree with Martin, but now I don't have to. I would vote for Tolkien.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you guys for this episode. It's a lot of fun. Thank you for the questions. Send any more if you'd like. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below. And if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.